The speaker today, Father John Bayer, from the Order of Cistercians. He entered Our Lady of Dallas Cistercian Abbey in 2007, and he made his solemn profession in 2012. He teaches English, Latin, and Theology of Cistercian Preparatory School. He's also an adjunct professor of theology at the University of Dallas. He received his doctorate from Pontifical Gregorian University, where he defended his dissertation on Saint Anselm of Canterbury, 2019. Now today, he's going to talk about a philosophical and theological perspective on objectivity. Let me remind you that at the end of this talk, you will be able to ask questions using the chat, or which I can read, or maybe you can raise your hand with the app Zoom and ask directly. Also, Father John, remind me that you can ask in the middle of the talk. You can ask some questions maybe to understand better what he's saying, so we can follow him. Okay. So having said that, Father John, please go ahead. We are all yours.
Okay. Let me share my screen, and folks can see my screen hopefully now, and I'll start from the first slide. Thank you very much for this invitation. It's a lot of fun for me to speak about these topics, and I think with a technology like Zoom, it's super fun to be able to speak with people all over the world. I wish I could give this presentation in Spanish. I have wanted to learn Spanish for a long time. A few months ago, I began with Duolingo, but my Spanish is not yet ready for something like this, maybe in the future. I will try always to speak clearly in English, but if that presents a barrier for someone, I hope that people will say, Father John, slow down, or Father John, you're starting to slur your words. I'm not offended by such things. Also, I will try to be conscious of the chat. And so I'll keep this open on the side. Hopefully you can't see the chat. I have the chat open on my screen, and hopefully all you see is the PowerPoint. So I will keep that open. Is that correct? Or do you see on my screen now the chat box? Hopefully you don't see it. So I'll keep it on the side. So if you have a question during the presentation, you can type it into the chat. I'll see it, and I'll try to integrate it into the presentation. And then, of course, we can stop at the end for a more lively question and answer. All right, so the topic about which I am to speak to you today is the idea of objectivity. And the sciences, particularly the hard sciences, like physics, for example, often have as an ideal an objective form of knowing, where we presume that everything we know can be brought before us as an object. And there's nothing that's real, nothing that's true, that lays outside of our purview, outside of our gaze. You know, the goal of, say, the positivist thinkers, beginning with, say, Descartes, and especially figures like Auguste Comte, a French philosopher, people who wanted to think that all of reality can be explained through number and formula, things that we can all put before our eyes as an object. So we're going to talk today about that presupposition, that ideal of objectivity, and we're going to critique it using the thoughts of Michael Polanyi. Michael Polanyi was a Hungarian. He began his career as a chemical physicist, and I know that he is important in the history of that discipline, but I don't know enough chemistry or physics to explain to you why. You can look him up and understand for yourself his significance as a scientist. But eventually he worked also in Germany, and then when World War II, even before the war began in the early 30s, he left Germany and went to England, and he made a career there as a scientist, but then ever more as a philosopher of science. And Michael Polanyi is famous for having expressed and defended very forcefully the idea that knowledge is personal, that is, only a human being, an intellect, a subject, a person who lives in community, a person who is free, a person who always speaks from a particular perspective or point of view is a subject of knowledge. And that much of our knowledge is what he calls tacit, that is, in a way, hidden from us, implied. and thus something that we cannot bring before ourselves as an object. And so in order to know anything in the world, to experience anything in the world, Michael Polanyi suggests that there's not only the thing that stands in front of us that we experience as an object, but in order to experience any object, there's also so much background that he would say is tacit, that we do not bring before ourselves to experience as an object. So Michael Polanyi is writing directly against the tradition of positivism and the modern ideal of objectivity, which would claim that everything can be reduced to formula and rule and number and so forth. All right. So Michael Polanyi, in the book that I recommended to you to read, The Tacit Dimension, begins to make his point by pointing out how we recognize faces. So we can't explain in comprehensive detail how it is that we recognize someone's face. You know, maybe we've all had that ability to see someone even after 10, 15 years and recognize the person by their face, even though it's changed a lot. Or if you were trying to describe the face of one person to another, have you ever felt just how poor and inadequate your effort to describe someone's face? You can recognize the face, but you can't tell very much about it. There are so many details that you apprehend, that you see, in order to be able to recognize that form that is someone's face. But many of those details you don't even explicitly recognize. You know, the shape of a skull, you know, how thick the hair seems, the different proportions. These are all details that you don't think of consciously, but you still know in order to be able to recognize and assert what you do know consciously. Ah, that face belongs to Father John. Similarly, when you're recognizing the different moods of a face, you know, it's very difficult to distinguish in words, say, an angry from a annoyed or a surprised, or maybe like, I don't know, we could pick these two faces over here. The guy's face over here, I would say he's maybe disgusted by something. Maybe he's also very angry about something or bitter about something. Maybe he's about to cry. Over here, this guy is disgusted, but he seems more curious or astonished. He doesn't look like he's about to cry. And if I were to try to describe the difference between those two moods, or rather how it is that I come to know that this guy seems like he might be about to cry, and this guy just seems like he's more surprised, it would be very difficult to explain that in words. All the details that shape my experience of those two moods, I could not lay on the table for you. So this is an important insight for Polanyi, and it's true about many other things, not just faces, that we know more than we can tell. There are so many details that we can't tell that we nonetheless know, and we know in the background in order to be able to recognize something like a face. He appeals also to Gestalt psychology to make this point, if that's something you're interested in. Okay, and so Gestalt psychology has demonstrated, you know, that we may know a physiognomy by integrating our awareness of its particulars without being able to identify these particulars. Okay, he makes another point about our use of tools, and you can begin to imagine connections already with science, insofar as a lot of science, in order to experience the world, relies upon tools or probes or ways of extending our sensory capacities. Polanyi says that in all knowing, there are two terms. There's a proximal term and a distal term. And he explains this using the experience of a tool. With a tool, say something like a cane, there is a proximal term or particulars that you're not explicitly aware of. There are things that you don't have before your eyes as an object, but you nonetheless know tacitly, he would say. Those are, with regard to a cane, what you experience in your hand. If you've ever used a cane as a probe, there are so many experiences going on in your hand of which you're not explicitly conscious, because what you are paying attention to, or what you are attending to, is the distal term of the probe, what's going on down here. And in fact, you use a probe in order to sense what's happening at the distal end. You do not hold a cane in order to sense consciously what's happening at the proximal end. If anybody was using a cane and focusing on what was happening in his hand, he would be running into things. The blind man must use the cane in order to attend to what's happening at this end. But of course, he has no neurons or nerves or anything at that end. What he's sensing tacitly is taking place here. But all those details, the subtle movements of the cane in his hand, the different resistance that he feels in his hand on account of what happens down here, he's not attending directly to those. But those are details from which he's attending in order to be able to sense what's happening down here. And so once again, in the act of experience, in the act of knowing, you have these two poles. And one of those poles has so much information that you don't explicitly know, that you can't tell, but nonetheless is vital in order to be able to experience anything. He says that tools are, in this sense, a bodily extension. They are things that extend our sensory capacities. He also says that there are intellectual theories that can allow us to extend our experience. Theories that, like tools, remain only or involve a lot of tacit knowledge, things that we don't have before our objective gaze in order to be able to experience any object. As an example, he offers music, but I also like to offer as an example sports. We'll begin with his example. So he points out how a piano player, in the act of performance, in the act of experiencing the object of music, has internalized so much theory, so many details about the music, about music theory, about the instrument. Details, for example, like how hard to press on a key in order to achieve a particular sound. So much of that, innumerable details. In the act of performance, the piano player knows only tacitly. In fact, if the piano player were to try to bring before her eyes all that tacit knowledge, to analyze all that theory in that moment, she would break her performance. To really experience the music, to know the music, you must know it as a whole, as the gestalt that you are attending to in the act of knowledge, as it were, as the unified face that you know. If you were to stop looking at the whole, at the gestalt of the music, and try to attend to each of the notes in their detail, the music would become clunky and it would fall apart. The piano player would be brought out of the moment, so to speak. The same thing happens in athletics. If you've ever seen, say, a really good basketball player, a person who knows his teammates, who knows the game, who can anticipate what other players are doing, he may not be able to explain in a formal argument why he thinks this player is going to cut in that direction, or how he thinks he should pass the ball such that he can score. There are so many things he knows in order to make such a play possible that he can't explain. Similarly in music. And so the tools that we have, like the cane, those are one thing, but theory is also like a tool, something that we internalize and often don't pay attention to in order to be able to know something. As an example, we can think of Copernicanism, and in particular, the Ptolemaic worldview before Copernicanism. So much theory was internalized in order to experience the world. And it was brilliant theory. I mean, we sometimes today people will make fun of Ptolemy or Aristotle or the pre-Copernican way of looking at the stars. But I would challenge anybody to try to understand the mathematics behind that way of looking at the stars, and you will see that these people were not unintelligent. They were brilliant. And one of the ways in which you see that is that they had a worldview in which the Earth was the center of the solar system, and they had different philosophical reasons for thinking that, which again were not unreasonable. Many of them are, of course, wrong, but they're not unreasonable. And in order to account for the movements of the planets, they had a system of mathematics and rules that were able to do that. And they presumed this worldview, and on the basis of this worldview, were able to correctly predict the movements of the planets. And so they knew the planets very well. And by remaining within this worldview, they experienced so much, and it was brilliant. But of course, the worldview was wrong. And so we have to think about how do we come to examine those worldviews and improve upon them. Polanyi would say you can only do that by having yet another worldview. You can only bring one worldview before your eyes as an object if at the same time you have another worldview tacitly outside your vision that is shaping your experience of the object. And philosophers and historians of science like Polanyi, but more famously and more importantly for this particular question, like Thomas Kuhn, studied the Copernican revolution. And they recognized that Copernicus was not motivated to switch from Ptolemy to a new model where the sun is at the center simply by following mathematical rules. Because again, the Ptolemaic system was mathematically very impressive. Copernicus was motivated by a worldview that gave a certain privilege to the sun and by an insight that he couldn't fully explain or defend. I mean, indeed, the definitive proof of Copernicanism would only come centuries later, even after Galileo. And so Copernicus could not prove formally, he had good arguments for it, but he could not prove formally. And so what shaped his sympathy with this idea of the sun at the center instead of the earth was one more worldview that he couldn't bring before his eyes with complete objectivity. Thomas Kuhn, I think, points out how much a kind of Platonism, and in Platonism, there's this great reverence for the sun as an image of the good. How Copernicus was, like many Renaissance thinkers, shaped by this resurgence in Platonic thinking. And so, in other words, not an objective, that is fully transparent, formally logical, rule-following, mechanical way of thinking, but much more personal way of thinking that is relying upon a background knowledge, a tacit knowledge, a worldview that he can't fully explain or articulate, but nonetheless shapes his experience of knowing. And so we are here, just to read a quotation now from Polanyi, we are approaching here a crucial question. The declared aim of modern science is to establish a strictly detached, objective knowledge. Any falling short of this ideal is accepted only as a temporary imperfection, which we must aim at eliminating. But suppose that tacit thought forms an indispensable part of all knowledge. Then the ideal of eliminating all personal elements of knowledge would in effect aim at the destruction of all knowledge. The ideal of exact science would turn out to be fundamentally misleading and possibly a source of devastating fallacies. So I have here these two images to sort of explain the alternatives. On the one hand, you have the modern ideal down here, where all knowledge can be reduced to rules and their application. It's a mechanical process. This is the ideal, at least, of Descartes and everyone forward in modernity. And it's given perhaps its highest expression in positivism, and logical positivism. But on the other hand, you have what Polanyi would defend, knowledge is a personal act. That is, only intellects know. And intellects are not just a system of rules. Intellects are like Copernicus, where in order to make great discoveries and new insights, you must have so much knowledge that is tacit, that is not reducible to formal rules, in order to be able to lead you outside of the box and to think in a new way. That, using that image, which I'll discuss later, outside the box is by definition not something that is limited only to rules. All right, can we look at some examples of this? So can we see examples of tacit knowledge, some concrete examples of tacit knowledge in all knowing and in particular in science? So one example, a very, very basic example, is the problem of the recognition of form. So if you read the text, Polanyi uses the example of a frog. We must know the frog as a frog before we can ever subject the frog to an analysis that would allow us to describe it in quantifiable terms or in any other term that would be formalizable. But this first step of knowing the frog as a frog, of reaching a substantial unity, of recognizing what the ancients like Plato and Aristotle would call the form of a thing, that is not something that can be reduced to rule. And one of the ways I like to try to explain that is by pointing out the reciprocal priority of deductive and inductive modes of reasoning. Perhaps and by reciprocal priority, that means how we can't really say absolutely how one comes before the other. That is, you can't say that a deductive method is the best method, and that's the one you should always use as opposed to an inductive method, nor can you say the reverse. Because depending on how you look at things, one always comes before the other, but you can't pick which way to settle on. You have to have both, a reciprocal priority. So how do I mean that? To explain that, I like using the example of the black swan. So a lot of people, in order to criticize deductive methods of thinking, will point out the black swan anecdote. And so far as I know this anecdote, people used to think that all swans were white. And so in the definition of swan was the trait of whiteness. And so you would know the essence of a swan, you would know that it's white. And from the essence, from the form, you would be able to deduce what is or is not a swan. And if you met a black bird, you would know it's not a swan. You would know that deductively because all swans are white. This bird is black. This bird is not a swan. However, as the explorers went out, they found, I think in China, black swans. And so the experience of many swans, an inductive method, led them to recognize what the actual form of a swan is. And so after repeated experience of different swans, some of them white, some of them black, you come up and you shape your definition, you recognize, swans can be either white or black. And so it's just not the case that all swans are white, but I know that through induction. And so people will use this as an example of how, induction is better than deduction. Well, I see your point. If I have a bad definition, induction can help me. But there's a reciprocal priority here because induction as a method presumes that I can recognize swans. In order to experience many swans, I have to know those individual creatures as swans. If I didn't already recognize the black swan as a swan, I wouldn't let it change my definition of a swan to a bird that includes both white and black creatures. And so you can't say that one comes before the other. You must be willing to accept both. Now that means, and I think this is to get back to Polanyi's point, that we are always reliant upon an intellect, a personal intellect that is able, sometimes erroneously, but at some point must be true if ever we are to know things, then an intellect is able to grasp a form and to know that's a frog, that's a swan. And you can't reduce that to a system of traits, black bird, orange beak, or whatever, because sometimes you will experience a new bird that you recognize belongs to this form, but doesn't fit the rules. And in order to make that experience possible, you need something that transcends the rules. Okay, a second example is for Polanyi, just the experience of scientific discovery. So he says that we must, if we're to do real science, be able to see a problem beyond what is already able to be formally recognized and defended. And moreover, a scientist must be able to commit to that problem and the search for its solution. Following formal rules for any model leaves us within the model, and only a personal intellect can know what it cannot tell and thereby critique the box from beyond it. And the big example here is once again Copernicus. So this happens all the time in scientific discovery, of course, but Copernicus is a famous example of somebody who was able to think outside the box. But once again, he did not think outside the box because he followed a system of rules. He did not mechanically or logically get from Ptolemy to Copernicanism. He had a whole different worldview that he couldn't objectively defend, but knew only tacitly, that encouraged him to see the problem in a new way and to search for a better way of describing what we now call the solar system. Polanyi speaks about the experience of an approaching discovery. That is an insight that maybe you've experienced this in the lab, maybe you've seen this in the history of science, where the great thinker, I think I see something. I can't fully defend it, but I have this intuition, this insight that it must be this way. And I'm so convinced of its potential fertility as an insight that I will spend years and years in the lab. And I will even put my reputation as a scientist at risk. People will make fun of me. People will reject my publications because I don't fit in the standard paradigm, that my theory is different. But I see something outside the box that I want to discover, and then at some point, hopefully try to some extent render before my eyes and prove in a way that others can become sympathetic with. But on the way to the discovery, we know so much more than we can tell, so much more than we can put in an objective argument. And so here's a final big quote that summarizes his conclusion. Polanyi says, "We must conclude that the paradigmatic case of scientific knowledge, in which all the faculties that are necessary for finding and holding scientific knowledge are fully developed, is the knowledge of an approaching discovery." So what he's saying is that using science as a big example for all modes of knowing, we can describe knowing as the experience of an approaching discovery, where we know something that we can't formalize. To hold such knowledge is an act deeply committed to the conviction that there is something there to be discovered. It is personal in the sense of involving the personality of him who holds it, and also in the sense of being, as a rule, solitary. And what I think he means there is that great scientists, they'll all have to some extent, a particular personality type. You know, a great scientist who breaks the mold is necessarily going to be a kind of personality that's tough, that has a lot of inner strength, that's willing to look weird to a lot of people. It's going to be a person who has a certain solitary ability, you know, a person who's able to think and move forward without oftentimes much encouragement. The discoverer is filled with a compelling sense of responsibility for the pursuit of a hidden truth, which demands his services for revealing it. His act of knowing exercises a personal judgment in relating evidence to an external reality, an aspect of which he is seeking to apprehend. The anticipation of discovery, like discovery itself, may turn out to be a delusion. We can be wrong in our acts of knowing. We can be wrong in our scientific theories. But that doesn't mean that this way of knowing is false. It just means that sometimes it doesn't always go well for whatever reason. But when it does go well, this is still the way in which knowing happens. Thus, it is futile to seek for strictly impersonal criteria of its validity, as positivistic philosophies of science have been trying to do for the past 80 years or so. To accept the pursuit of science as a reasonable and successful enterprise is to share the kind of commitment on which scientists enter by undertaking this enterprise. You cannot formalize the act of commitment, or you cannot express your commitment non-committally. Think again of Copernicus. Copernicus couldn't have expressed his commitment to heliocentrism in a way that would be non-committal. Copernicus could not say, just do the math, man. It's not me. It's this impersonal mechanical argument that proves Copernicanism. Copernicus would have to say, I think it's this way, and I have some reasons, but this is not an absolute, apodictic, fully objective proof of heliocentrism. There's a commitment that's involved in approaching a discovery. To attempt to dispense with the commitment or to try to formalize the commitment in a way that's non-committal, to pretend as if your conviction could be described simply as a mechanical, impersonal argument, that is to exercise the kind of lucidity which destroys its subject matter. In other words, it's an attempt to do what the pianist, the person playing the piano, should not do if the piano player wants to protect the whole of the performance. If the piano player were to try to understand and justify to herself, to measure every keystroke and quantify all the relations, that would destroy the work of art. Polanyi has different examples of this, and so does Newman. But John Henry Newman, somebody who was important for Polanyi, and there are many similarities between them, spoke about the difference between a cook and a chemist. You know, we probably can sense the difference between somebody whose style of preparing food is completely bound by rule and by chemistry and by quantity, and someone who has a much more intuitive grasp of the whole of what's being prepared, and indeed knows many details that the chemist might also know, different quantities and things like that, but holds that all in a kind of tacit way, like the piano player, in order to perform the act of knowledge of cooking. Hence the failure of the positivist movement in the philosophy of science. And now the challenge. The difficulty today after positivism is to find a stable alternative to its ideal of objectivity. This is indeed the task for which the theory of tacit knowing should prepare us. So Polanyi doesn't want to leave us in a kind of relativism where the objectivity of the positivist was trying to get at a stable notion of truth, something that would be recognized by all. And they thought that we had to make knowledge impersonal in order to be able to get all persons to recognize it. Because if there was an aspect of knowing that was subjective, then it seemed to make knowing something that could not be shared. It seemed to betray the idea of a real truth, or as we sometimes say today, of an objective truth, something that we all have to recognize. That's the modern ambition. And thus, modernity would dispense with faith, would dispense with tradition, would dispense with authority, and insist upon a form of knowing that we can all bring before our eyes together through an idea of reason that was, for them, objective. Polanyi says that doesn't work. We've got to be honest with ourselves. We don't know that way. Our mode of knowing is an inherently personal one. But for Polanyi, we don't want to jump from there to relativism or to despair of the reality of truth, or the reality that we can altogether know it. And thus he wants to avoid what you could perhaps say is a collapse into post-modernity, where in modernity, we all wanted to know, there was rationalism, science was amazing, we can all know together, we can get rid of subjective things like faith. And then when that project crashed, and a lot of historians think that that project crashed sometime around the world wars, where we saw how science does not lead us to a more rational way of living on its own. Science indeed may discover many things, but then we behave like total barbarians. Something is missing in our ability to reason well in community. It's not enough to have amazing technologies, because then man in his rationality can use those technologies and do horrible things in World War I and World War II. And so a lot of people at that point thought that the modern project and this enlightenment project of rationality and objective truth, and how if we all just sit down and calculate together, we will come to a stable order. They recognize that that's not true. And so some people collapsed in a kind of despair to postmodernity, where after the modern project, what's left? Just the devastation and the acceptance that, well, there just must not be a truth. If science couldn't lead us to the truth, there must just not be truth. And so you believe your thing, you believe you think, you do what you want, you do what you want, and so forth. Polanyi does not want either way. Instead, he wants to return to a more honest and human way of reasoning. And that means to a form of reasoning that recognizes tacit knowledge. And within that idea of tacit knowledge, he recovers what for a Catholic would be very, very welcome. So he recovers an idea of authority and tradition and even faith and metaphysical conviction. So first principles about the nature of reality that science itself presupposes. You know, the idea that there is this truth out there to be known, or that my mind corresponds to it. These are metaphysical convictions that the scientist presupposes in order to begin to do science. Similarly, there's a kind of authority that makes science possible. And thus, as Catholics, we don't have to pretend as if authority is a bad word, which a lot of people want us to think is a bad word. Authority is actually a gift to the human intellect. Just ask any scientist in training how much authority is involved in the development of science. Science would never work if every student never trusted the teacher. If a student were not able to accept as an authority the teacher. Moreover, every scientist must also, even when they're at the height of their career, must depend upon authority. Authority of a guild, authority of other scientists in realms of expertise that are different than my own. Our work in the sciences touches everything. And there's no one of us who can master all knowledge. We must hold so much tacitly, and we must hold so much on authority. And with authority comes also tradition, insofar as this authority is not only in our contemporaries, but also in the past. So those are just some of hopefully the fertile implications of Polanyi's way of describing things. So I did it. It's about 38 minutes there. I can stop here and we can do questions if we've survived, and if hopefully that made enough sense to which we can discuss.
Thank you, Father. Let's thank Father John for this wonderful talk. Are there any questions?
Hi, yes. Hi, Father John. My name is Diana. I am a computer science student here in Mexico City. Thanks a lot for the talk. It was pretty interesting. And I wanted to say that I think this is related to, I don't know, maybe you have heard about Thomas Samuel Kuhn and the theory of scientific revolutions.
Oh,
and he
yeah.
says almost the same, that science is only a model in which we can relate to reality, but we can't access to reality itself. Mm-hmm. And I think this is also related with a problem which arises with artificial intelligence, because there is a model that can detect cancer with a precision of 98% of precision. And it can detect cancer, but we don't know how it does it. It can do it, but we don't know how it does. We don't know how it works. Yeah. It of course works with some mathematical model behind. And I don't know, I was thinking it was related to that thing of the faces, that we can recognize the person, but we don't know exactly how we can do it. Yeah. And that's it. I just wanted to give thank you and say that. Thanks a lot.
Those are two excellent points. I'd love to address both. First, if I understood you correctly, you mentioned Thomas Kuhn. And Thomas Kuhn was an important thinker in the history of science, particularly with the Copernican revolution. And Polanyi is indeed building on his insight. And my understanding of Thomas Kuhn is that he spoke of different paradigms, right? And paradigm shifts. And I think that there might be ambiguity in Thomas Kuhn himself, but at least some of his successors, like I think Feuerabend, I think is a successor of Thomas Kuhn, who took one line of interpretation of the theory of paradigms to suggest that we don't really ever know reality. We only have our models of reality. Polanyi certainly wouldn't say that. And I'm not sure if Thomas Kuhn would say that. I don't know him well enough, but I know some people interpret the theory of paradigms to say that. That is, I think, a good example of the kind of postmodern way where all we have are our models and there's no connection between our model and reality. I think Polanyi would say that our models have some bearing upon reality, and we for sure can know reality precisely in order to critique our models. So I do think it was an advance in knowledge when we left the Ptolemaic system behind and adopted Copernicanism. We have an ability to evaluate models. And Polanyi's contention would be that we can only do that because we have this tacit contact with reality in a way that transcends our models and thus allows us to critique them. But still, our contact with reality is always going to come with yet another model. So we can get out of a box only by being within another box. And yet Polanyi would insist that there's some relation between these different boxes and actual reality. Even if our mode of knowing always has, you know, a worldview, a box, so to speak, that doesn't mean it's completely false. So that's one point. So he has more hope for human knowledge and contact with truth, even if he's not naive, and he recognizes that we must critique our models. But the possibility of critique is based upon the fact that we can also know the truth. You also raised a really good point about artificial intelligence, and I think there are clear applications of Polanyi's thought to artificial intelligence. So his contention, once again, is that knowing cannot be reduced to rules. However, we sure can create, you know, systems of rules that do allow us to do a lot of really helpful things technologically. So I may not be able to reduce to rule the knowledge of a person's face, but I can try and list, you know, 1,000 different features and plug that into a computer, and the computer might be able to correctly identify the face. Now, that system of rules, like the cancer detection, might have 98%. Very impressive. But I think Polanyi would say the computer still does not know the face. It does not actually get to the gestalt, nor does the computer actually get to cancer as a form. It only has a system of rules that it applies. And we see that system fail when the person grows and their face alters a little bit, or when cancer develops in a new way that we haven't anticipated and thus haven't entered into the rules. So yeah, we can do a lot of really powerful stuff by trying to formalize knowledge, but his contention is there's always going to be this gap between the reality that's actually known by the intellect and a formal mathematical description of it.
Great. Are there any other questions?
¿Ya? Híjole. ¿Entonces desayunar y los alcanzas? Claro.
I have a question, Father. Well, it's like something that came to my mind when I was reading the book. Do you know this mental experiment called Mary's Room?
I don't think so.
Okay, Mary's Room. So it's this scientist in a room, in a world, a black and white world, and she has access to all the information about colors. Everything, I mean, equations and concepts and everything. And then she goes out and see the world as it is with colors. And the question is, does she learn something new?
Mm-hmm.
So this was attempted to fight against physicalism, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And the point is that if there are any knowledge that cannot be put into words or equations or something else, yeah, and I think this is related, right? With
absolutely. Absolutely. So I think Polanyi would say there is knowledge that can't be put into words. he would say that Mary, when she leaves the room, does in fact learn something new. Yeah, we would. So, for example, if he makes this point that all words ultimately trace back to a meaning that's based on pointing. So I think this is true about the philosophy of language, that the origin of meaningful words is always in an act of pointing, where, you know, when we learn our first words, you know, mommy, daddy, ice cream, blue, pink, whatever. And from there, our vocabulary builds. And then through abstraction, we can begin to slice our words. But all knowledge begins in experience, and all meaningful words begin in experience. So what Mary knows in the room with just quantities and formulas is not the actual thing.
Do you think that there is something maybe like a kind of fear now in the modern science that to not accept this kind of knowledge because it cannot be like defined or put into the quiz or something?
Yeah.
Maybe there's like fear that we don't want to talk about it because we can express that, right?
Yeah, I think in the scientific community and in the broader society, we want, I think it seems to me, desperately to feel certain about our knowledge. And we want to feel certain that our actions are right and just. We don't like saying, I think it's this way. I'm going to take responsibility for this decision. I might be wrong, but I'm convinced we should go this way. I can't prove it by some impersonal system of rules. I can only tell you what I think as I reason, and I'm responsible for it. And because then if I'm wrong, everybody says, well, it was your fault. And it's like, it was my fault, you know, I'm sorry. Hopefully I'll do better next time. But we don't like that. We want to feel certain. We don't want ever to be blamed. And so we want to pretend like thinking is not an act of responsibility. We want to pretend like thinking is just a mechanical operation. And that leads us to all kinds of problems, I think, in society, because we try to govern everything by science and we don't recognize the personal choices that we're making. And the way in which, to use language from Polanyi again, so much of our thinking is rooted in faith, tradition, and authority. And in a secular world that refuses to recognize those aspects of knowing, we end up doing a lot of things without being honest.
Yeah, exactly. So it will be something that people don't want to recognize, actually.
Yeah. And I think you're right to point out that a lot of it's just rooted in fear. We don't want to be found wrong or something.
Mm. So I think, Jacobo, you have a question.
Yes, thank you. Well, first of all, thank you, Father, for this great talk. I think it will give us a lot of sort of philosophical tools that we can use to discuss faith and to evangelize. Obviously, evangelization is not, it's not handing out content to people, but it can help us a lot to, think straight matters of faith. And in fact, my question is related to this. How do you relate Polanyi's concept of tacit knowledge with our sensus fide? I'm not sure if I'm using this term correctly, but I mean the way that we know things of God, of revelation and so forth. Because, interestingly, you mentioned that this Polanyi's critique could sort of open the door more towards tradition and authority. But as you were developing the talk, I actually was thinking the opposite, that it opened something beyond authority and tradition, because those things were in a sense objective, right? But it also opened the door to something like a personal knowledge of the faith, right? So I was interested in how you would relate this concept to the personal faith.
Okay, I think what you ask is a very good question, and if I'm not good at answering it, push me again. I think that Polanyi would say that personal knowledge, that's an expression he uses, he's got a book titled that way, is necessarily also communal. And so to say that knowledge is personal is not to say it's subjective in a negative sense or relativistic. It's necessarily communitarian. and thus enter authority and tradition. And that means that the mode of knowing, which Polanyi finds in the sciences, is something that the theologian, the Catholic theologian, will find very familiar. You know, we, insofar as we've been thinking as Catholic theologians, faith-seeking understanding, you know, where in order to know the truth, I must remain within the community, receive humbly the past. These are things that we're very used to as Catholics. And so we should feel very comfortable, I think, with a method like Polanyi's. In a way, we've been like, you know, this is maybe to exaggerate a bit, but we've been like the only honest thinkers all this time, insofar as we have known that our knowledge is a knowledge of faith-seeking understanding. And certainly the modern pretension, beginning with someone like Descartes, to say, so many people argue about so many things, so get rid of the past. I'm going to think about it all by myself in this chair from my own thought, that's so naive, so naive. And we've been much more self-aware, much more critical as Catholics. And that, I think, is evangelically powerful, you know, because it helps the modern man become sympathetic with categories like faith, tradition, authority that the Catholic needs in order to be able to communicate the faith, the worldview.
Well, let's thank Father John for this wonderful talk. We thank you, Father, and well, let's see you next time.